If I can get through this recording without something going wrong, I will be so happy. Welcome to Casual Friday. So I want to start off by thanking all of you who gave me feedback on what a knit-along looks for you. I'd asked last week for ideas about potentially doing a knit-along and what that would look like to you. How do you imagine or see knit-alongs? How do you participate in them? So I could get an idea about whether or not that's something that I would want to do. What I got out of this is that there are a lot of different ways that a knit-along can be imagined or can be done, which is great, because that means that whatever I come up with is going to satisfy at least some people, and may even satisfy people who never thought of a knit-along as being what I think of as a knit-along, or the kind of thing that I'd be willing to do as a knit-along. So some of the ideas were things like, well, your own pattern. Of course, one of your designs would be fun. Or some people talked about mystery knit-alongs, how much they enjoyed those. Some people talked about how a knit-along could just have a theme and people could be doing their own thing that went along with that theme. And those are all great ideas. So what I am thinking of doing for myself, because it has to be something that I enjoy doing, is that I will do my first one. I think will be fairly straightforward and will be based on one of my own designs. It'll be one that isn't super difficult, but might have some new skills for some people. It's one of my first, or it is, I think it might actually be my first published design. It was a design that I created for a class. I taught it at the yarn shop. I just created this pattern, but really in the form of classroom materials. And when the project was on display at the shop, people started asking just to buy the pattern. They didn't want to take the class, but they wanted the pattern. So I created a pattern, and I was able to also upload it to Ravelry and sell it on Ravelry. And again, it was my first pattern. It's probably 10 years old. It's in dire need of updating. I've learned a few things about writing patterns since then, and I have some things that I've been wanting to do to update that pattern. I'd intended to do this last spring and then just didn't get around to it. I decided to learn to spin instead. So I think the first knit-along is going to be that updated pattern, and it will motivate me to actually get those updates done. I really like designing, and I really like seeing my design come to fruition and see that it works out. I really dislike the last 10 to 15% of writing a pattern, which is not creative at all. And it is detail focused, and it requires catching every little inconsistency. And it's something that I don't enjoy doing. So it's why I often don't publish patterns after I design something. It's work. It's not fun. It's something I need to get over already. So anyway, that will be the first knit-along. And then my idea for the second knit-along, which would probably be later in the winter. I'm still kind of working through what exactly I want to do and how I would create videos surrounding that, as well as paper-based content that could be downloaded that would be associated with it. And that would be something that would be a design your own. So people at any level could participate. You could learn a lot about things like gauge and stitch counts and all different aspects. It'll be a relatively simple project, probably a hat. And we'll go through the components of things to think about for when you're designing, as you go through each component, as you're transitioning from one stage to another. I think that could be a really good knit-along. If you like that idea, let me know. If you think it's terrible, you can let me know too. If enough people think it's a terrible idea, I'll probably steer away from it. And then we'll see how those two types of knit-alongs pan out, and then I can decide going forward how often I might want to do something like that, and what types of knit-alongs I would offer. So I also want to thank those of you who responded to my launch of my Ko-fi page. If you don't want to hear anything about Ko-fi, I just wanted to answer some questions and comments that had come up surrounding Ko-fi and how it works. So if you're not interested in that, there's links down in the video description so you can jump to the next section. But I thought I'd just explain a little bit more about what Ko-fi is as I understand it so that you can get a better idea. So Ko-fi is a free platform, a free website for creators like me, people who are creating content on the internet, to be able to have people support them in some small way. Like you could buy a coffee for, say, $3, or you could buy multiple coffees if you wanted, or you could subscribe and have and automatically buy me a coffee every month through PayPal. So I don't pay anything to use their platform, just as with a standard Ko-fi page. But if I want people to be able to subscribe and do the auto updates, then I have to be a Ko-fi Gold member, which I am. And that's only $5 or $6 a month that I pay. So I'm supporting the platform that's providing me the ability to have people support me. If you want to support me, you don't have to be a member, I don't believe, just to buy a coffee. I believe the way it works is that you do have to have a login ID in order to take advantage of, like, if you wanted to subscribe for auto payment or something like that. As a Ko-fi Gold member, and they're going to try to say, oh, you should upgrade your membership, you should create your own creator page. And if that's not something that you do, if you don't create content, you're not looking for people to support you in that way, there's no reason for you to create your own Ko-fi page, and there's certainly no reason for you to upgrade to Ko-fi Gold if what you're doing is supporting creators. As a Ko-fi Gold member, though, that gives me the ability to have subscribers, but also it gives me the ability to upload content that can only be seen by people who have supported me. So I could upload posts, I could upload images, or I could even upload videos. So that is something I'm considering. So I'm never going to reduce the number of videos I upload to my YouTube channel and then transfer those to my Ko-fi page. I would never do that. I might at some point in the future decide to create maybe bonus videos or bonus content of some sort. I don't know what that would look like. I might do that for my Ko-fi supporters. I just don't know yet. It's all very new to me, so I'll just kind of learn as I go. Oh, I'm a little out of breath. I was puppy sitting, and for my sister-in-law, she just came and I just ran up and down the stairs. So I'm a little out of breath. Okay, so knitting update. I am at one of these points in my knitting where I'm like, oh, I need something to knit. I don't have anything to knit. I've been working on my brother's pair of socks, and I really like having a pair of socks that I can always have lying around and always be working on a pair of socks if I want, because it's pretty mindless for me. But it's September. The weather has gotten cooler. The days are getting shorter. It's sort of, you know, the school year has begun. I feel like this is the time I should be really launching into my knitting. And I've been dying to knit a sweater. When my daughter was here a few weeks ago from Southern California, she saw the sweater I had knit for my other daughter and said, well, that's really cute. And she wanted one just like it. So we picked out some yarn that I happen to have in my stash, perfect color for her. And then I started thinking about, she's got more sensitive skin. It's a regular, just plain old wool. It's not superwash. It's not merino, and it's a high neck. And I thought it's going to be itchy on her, and really thought I needed to use something that was going to be gentler on her skin. So she was already back in California by that time. So I sent her a link to Webb's Cascade 220 like superwash merino yarn. I thought, well, the combination of superwash merino, that should be soft enough for her neck. And they have just a million colors. So I said, you know, pick something out from there and I'll order it, and that's what I'll use to knit that sweater. And she said, oh, I like this color and I like that color. And so I thought, okay, I'll buy her sweater's worth of yarn in each color. I ordered the yarn. This is like almost 3 weeks ago. And usually they ship right away. And it wasn't shipped. And then I realized, oh, it's because one of the colors was back ordered. And so I asked them, I said, do you not ship things until the whole order is there? And they said, basically they said I'd ordered 7 balls of one color and 6 of the other. I don't even know why, but I did that. And it was the one that was 7 balls that was on back order. And so because most of the order was back order, they were going to wait. And I said, well, can you please ship the other color? Because then I thought, well, I can get started on this sweater. So that yarn came, and I just confirmed with my daughter that it was okay to knit that sweater with this blue color that she liked. She goes, oh, no, I want that sweater in the red. So that's on. They just shipped it yesterday, but it's going to take almost a week to get here. So I didn't want to start a sweater for myself. I have yarn that I bought myself last spring that I want to make into a sweater. I have spinning projects that I want to do that I don't have the fiber for yet. I've been waiting to get that fiber. I'm going to a retreat soon where I'm going to be dyeing some fiber, and I want to use that. And so I'm just in the sort of like, what am I, I don't have any, and I don't have much of a stash except for sock yarn. So really all I could do was knit another sock, which isn't helpful. So that's my sad story with my knitting update. I had a question on this week's Technique Tuesday video, and I'm going to read the question so I get it right. It was, where did you learn these techniques? The Master Hand Knitting course, reading books, or just experimenting? And so she was referring to the video that I made on fixing mistakes that you don't discover until after you've completed your project. So maybe you discover there was a drop stitch somewhere, so you have a live stitch this on the fabric, and you have to try to find a way to tack that down and make it as unnoticeable as possible. Or maybe you created an accidental yarn over, so you created an extra stitch and then there's a hole at the base of it. Or potentially you have both, where you dropped a stitch but you created a new one on top of it, so you have a drop stitch and a hole and you have to fix that. So she wanted to know, well, where did you learn these techniques? And I get this type of question every couple of months. I'll put some video out, and people will say, why have I not learned this? I've never seen this in a book. Or why doesn't anybody teach me this? Or and sometimes they'll be a little mad about it, like, I can't believe nobody ever showed me this. And they'll be a little mad about it. Why hasn't anybody said this? And I don't know the answer to that. Typically, these are not techniques that I learned from a book. They are techniques that either I've heard other knitters talking about in terms of approaching how to solve a problem, or they are the result of me trying to solve a problem or wondering, well, I don't like this result. What would happen if I do this? I call this AnalyKnitting or AnalyKnits. Like I'm going to do some AnalyKnits and, figure this out. And I think there are a number of things that lead me to do this. And so I wanted to kind of explain how the Master Hand Knitting program helped me get there, but not directly. It's not like these are not the direct result of something I learned from the Master Hand Knitting program. In the Master Hand Knitting program, there are always a bunch of swatches at each level that you have to knit. And in the first level, most of the swatches are very clearly laid out what you have to do. Cast on 20 stitches. Work in knit 2, purl 2 ribbing until it's, however long. Increase 5 stitches evenly across the row, and then work in stockinette until the entire swatch is this length, and then bind off. So the idea is, can you follow the instructions? Oh, and then what you have to do is every swatch has to be washed and blocked, and it has to be tagged in the upper left-hand corner. So let me show you an example of, I think this is swatch 1 for the Master Hand Knitting program, level 1, at least when I did it. It may not be exactly the same now, I don't know. So here's the swatch. So you can see that I have knit 2, purl 2 ribbing, and then I have garter stitch, and then I've got the tag in the upper left hand corner. And on the back of the tag is my name and contact information, and on the front of the tag is the swatch number and what the technique is. I'm not, at that time there was certain information that had to be included on the tag. I think now you might only need to say something like swatch 1 on it, and then you have a sheet in the sheet protector that gives more information. They change things every so often, but the point is it has to be in the upper left hand corner, and the swatch has to be washed and blocked. So at the time that I was doing level 1, there was no such thing as Ravelry, but the Knitting Guild Association had online forums, and they had some specific forums that were for people going through the program. So level 1 people, there was a whole little group for those places where you could ask questions, level 2 and level 3. And one of the questions that came up a lot, which I found very puzzling, was, well, how do you keep track of which swatch is which? As you're knitting all your swatches, what do you do to keep track of which one is which, before they're washed and blocked? And I thought, well, they're all different. How do you not know, for example, that this is knit 2, purl 2 ribbing and garter stitch? How do you not know that that's that? Well, this one is knit 1, purl 1 ribbing and stockinette. I didn't, you should be able to tell that apart. Well, one of the reasons for the tags, in addition to marking whose it is in case it gets separated from the binder, is to demonstrate that you can tell up from down in your knitting. So a swatch like this is pretty obvious, but if you have a square of seed stitch that's pretty much the same from top to bottom, you need to demonstrate that you know where the upper left hand corner is, that you know which direction you've knitted. You can tell your cast on edge from your bind off edge. And again, I didn't have trouble with that, so I didn't understand why they did. And I felt like, well, the point of this, a lot of the point of it was so that you should be able to do this. You shouldn't because what the answer to this question about how do you guys keep track of it was that some people said, oh, as soon as I'm finished with a swatch, I put a tag on it. And I thought, okay, so then you haven't learned to tell the top from the bottom. You haven't learned to distinguish one thing from the other. And wouldn't that be something that you'd want to work on? So these are just things I had, and I wasn't going to tag my things right away because I had to wash and block them. So I don't know if some people were finishing the swatch, washing and blocking, then tagging, and then moving on. I'm not sure exactly what they were doing, but I had in my head they should be able to do this. So at some point I had all my swatches done, and I learned how to wash and block. I hadn't ever done that before, so I had to figure out how to do that. They don't tell you how. You're told you have to do that, and you have to figure it out. Just like you're told you have to increase 5 stitches evenly, and you have to figure out what does that mean. So they're giving you specific instructions, but they don't always tell you how to do that. Well, some of the swatches are mostly just stockinette stitch. And what they have is different increases or different decreases that you're demonstrating, and you have to place them in very specific locations. And how you do that with increases is a little bit different depending on the type of increase it is. And with the decreases, they did sort of directly explain to us that there are blended decreases and full fashion decreases. And blended decreases were like if you have a swatch like this and it's getting narrower, you're working decreases, so it's getting narrower. That blended decreases would be decreases that leaned in that same direction as the edge was leaning, where full fashion would be decreases that leaned toward the edge. So there was a series of swatches that had you demonstrate full fashioned decreases and blended decreases, and they were having you use all different kinds of decreases, just like they had you use all different kinds of increases in other swatches. And as I worked these different increases, and I was observing what the difference was between them, so I could tell which direction I had knit. I knew what my cast on versus bind off edge looked like. I could tell the increases apart, so there was no problem. So I was tagging all my swatches, and I got up through swatch 6 and swatch 7. And then I had to do swatch 8. And I realized I had 2 swatches that were identical. And I could tell swatches 10 and up through 17, no problem. But there were 2 swatches, 8 and 9. And they were different from each other. They used different decreases, completely different techniques. but I had two swatches that were exactly the same. And so I thought, oh, I have knit one of these swatches twice. Let me see if I can figure out from reading the instructions for the different swatches if I can tell which one of these I knit twice, and then I can knit the other one. And I couldn't tell. And these were swatches that used blended decreases. So they had to knit two together at the left edge on both swatches. One of them used a decrease that was called SSK, and the other one used a decrease that was called SKP. So SKP means slip one, as if to knit one, and then pass the slip stitch over. That creates a decrease. The other decrease was called SSK. It was slip two stitches, one at a time, as if to knit, then insert your left needle through the fronts of those two stitches, wrap your yarn around and pull it through to complete the decrease. The two very different techniques. And I didn't know which one was the one that was creating the result I was seeing. So I thought, okay, I'm going to knit a third swatch and I'll just follow the directions for swatch number 8 and see what happens. And so I started doing that. I'm like, no, I'm getting the same thing that I got already. So it was swatch number 9 that I didn't do. So I started following the directions for swatch number 9 and I was getting the same result again. And I was completely confused by this. I didn't understand how two techniques that were so different from each other could produce the same result. How could that be? So I sat there. I remember exactly where I was sitting. I was like so confused by this. And this is when the way I read my knitting changed from looking at the result to looking at how the technique actually works, what is actually going on to produce that result. So I could always follow the directions and I could always get the result I wanted, but I didn't ever, previous to that, really pay attention to what was happening that caused that result to occur. So I watched as I slipped each stitch one at a time and then brought the working yarn through those stitches and saw how they stacked on top of each other, untwisted, leaning to the left. And then I knit a few stitches and then I knit the SKP. I slipped one stitch and then I knit the other one. And then I pulled that stitch over and I kept taking them apart and doing them again until I finally understood what was really going on. There were these two stitches and basically you just want them stacked on top of each other and you want to pull working yarn through the centers of those. And there are two different ways of doing that. And that was amazing to me. Now, a lot of you are probably thinking, well, everybody knows the SSK creates the same result as SKP. And I think it is pretty commonly known now because of Ravelry, and people will just tell knitters, oh, you can just if you prefer SSK, you can just substitute, it gives the same result. But knowing that and seeing why that was true was the mental shift that I needed to really understand how knitting works. So I had been up to that point very good at superficially reading my knitting and seeing what was going on, recognizing if something was wrong. But until then, I didn't understand how knitting works. After that mental shift, when I became an AnalyKnitter, I started looking at how stitches were interconnected to each other. So not just how is a particular technique performed, like what's going on within that particular technique, but how are stitches connected to each other in a row, and how are they connected from one row to another. So one of the tips I got somewhere, it may have been on that Knitting Guild forum. The tip was about how to learn how to do reverse duplicate stitch, where you're weaving in yarn tails along the path of a particular row. The beauty of that technique is then, because the tail is following all the stitches, when you stretch the fabric, the tail will stretch with it and be less likely to pop through to the front. So this was something I'd never heard of before. And there wasn't anything in any book that showed this. I mean, this is one of the things where I got mad when I heard about it. It was like, why didn't anybody ever tell me that? I've been weaving in my ends, on the diagonal, turning around and coming back. I've been doing that all my life. And so I went through all my books. And the reason I was weaving in yarn tails at the diagonal like that was because that's what my books told me to do. None of them said how to do reverse duplicate stitch. So it was that same feeling. I just remembered that's the same feeling that I had, that some people who comment on these videos, why didn't anybody ever tell me this? Because there were no references where this is how you do it, at least at that time, we were told, well, here's how you can learn how to do that. Knit yourself a swatch in a light colored yarn, and halfway up that swatch, switch to a contrast color for one row. And I don't know if I was told this or if this is something that I just figured out later, was if you do that, but you use a needle that's a couple of sizes bigger, it really allows you to spread the stitches out more easily. It's a more open fabric and you can see how that is. And then you can take a strand of yarn and you can learn how to follow the path of stitches. So it's something you can learn in stockinette. But you can also do this in other stitch patterns, so you can see, well, what happens when you switch, when it's only purls or if it's only knits, and then what happens if it's a knit row on top of a purl row like it is for garter stitch, or what happens if you're alternating a knit with a purl such as ribbing. How does that strand of yarn move along a row? But one of the most informative things about that swatch exercise is that you can look on the back and you can see the little color blips that in the purl bumps on the back and how separated they are. They're not next to each other. And then you can see how the different rows are connected to each other. So one row is connected to the row above and the row below, but the above and below one are connected to each other in a way too. So it was doing that. That was really helpful. And then the other thing that I did was I tried to draw knitting. So I would draw a row of stitches, just kind of like these curls like this, and I would draw them with parallel lines so that I had like the thickness of a yarn. So I'd have that. And then I would try to draw the row above or below connected to it so that I had the legs on the front versus the back, you know, just what did I have to erase to make it look like knitting? And it really shifted my focus from sort of big picture to what was really going on. And it's that kind of an exercise where you really understand how stitches are interconnected. That's what allows you to fix mistakes. When you understand how stitches are interconnected to each other and you are knitting along a row and you realize, oh, something went wrong in the row below, yes, you can find a video or instruction about how do you fix that mistake that you can look up in a book. But when you understand how stitches are interconnected with each other, you don't need to look it up because you know what you need to do to stack stitches on top of each other to create one kind of a decrease versus another, and then how to pull the little loop of yarn that's been pulled out of it. You know, when you ladder down, you can figure out how to do it. So it's that kind of thing that changes the way that you think about knitting. When I first learned to knit with charts that weren't like color charts like Fair Isle or Intarsha charts, which are stockinette, and so you're only looking at the color changes. When I learned to knit from charts that were textured, one of the things I was doing was I was translating the symbol into what it would be like if it was a written instruction. So I was translating the symbol to the instruction for what to perform. So, oh, this slanted line means, you know, knit two together. So translate to that slanted line means knit two together. And I might have to look it up on the chart to figure it out. And over time I realized, oh, well, it's slanted, well, for you it would be slanted like this. No, it would be slanted like this. A knit two together results in something that is slanted like that, and so that's why the symbol is that way. And then I realized, oh, well, my working needle is pointed in that direction when I'm making the knit two together, so I can think of that action in that way. So over time I sort of transitioned how I could interpret chart symbols, and now when I look at them, I don't look at what the instructions are. I don't look at a symbol and think, well, the instruction for that, the action for that is such and such. I'm looking at it and saying, that is the result I'm supposed to get. I'm supposed to get something that leans to the left. How do I do that? So I'm doing it in a different way than I used to. And all that comes from just understanding how the stitches interconnect and what the actions are. So I'm not following specific instructions, I'm looking for the result that I want. So in the case of something like Technique Tuesday, this past Technique Tuesday, when I was showing how to fix a mistake, these aren't necessarily mistakes that I have made and I had to learn how to do them, and I'm telling you, these were things if at the time I would have made a mistake like that, I would have had no idea how to fix it. I probably would have ripped everything out. So often my videos are created because I'm answering a question that has come up. Somebody asks, how do I fix this? And that's what happened with the Technique Tuesday video. Somebody had a problem that they asked in my Rocks group, and we explained it, and I thought, oh, this would make a good video. And then I started thinking about what are the other related scenarios that could create a similar problem. So how do you diagnose which scenario you actually have, and then how do you fix each of those scenarios? So sometimes it's stuff that I just haven't even thought about before. And then I think, okay, well, how would I solve that problem so that it would be the least obvious that it could possibly be? Just knowing all the techniques that I already know and how stitches interact, what would be the way to do that? Sometimes I'm trying to solve a problem myself. So I might be, like with the 3-needle bind-off. Earlier this year I did one on finessing the 3-needle bind-off, where you want the chain to be on the right side of the work. It's a decorative element, and usually there's that big ridge that you see, and I don't like that big ridge. I wanted something different. And I remember years ago trying to figure out, well, is there a way to do this 3-needle bind-off in pattern? Like, what if I did knit 2 together, then purl 2 together, and then, like, I was trying different things and trying to figure out how to make that ridge more palatable, or less dependent on directionality, because there really was a front and a back to it, as well as a right and a left. And I was just trying different things, like how can I join these 2 stitches in different ways? So I did knit 2 together, then I did purl 2 together, and then I thought, well, was there a way to knit from the front but purl from the back, and how would I do that? And so then I figured out how to do that. I'm not the first one or only one to figure this out, but that does come from experimenting, and a lot of times the experimenting comes from trying to answer a question that I have. Like, I want a better result than what I'm getting. What can I do? Other times I'm experimenting with, once I learned about that SSK and SKP were 2 different ways of getting to the same endpoint, which was a revelation to me, I started to see that that was true in a lot of situations. There are multiple ways of doing the long tail cast on, and you get the same result, but you do it in very different ways. And I had learned both of them when in the first 20 years that I was a knitter, and I learned them with different names, like the continental method and the thumb method. They were 2 different ways of doing a cast on, 2 different cast ons, I thought. And then in the Master Hand Knitting program, people were talking about the long tail cast on. I didn't know what that was. So I found some directions for the long tail cast on, and I realized, oh, I already know this. I didn't know that that was what that was called. And then I realized it has a bunch of different names besides that. So then I started doing things like provisional cast-ons, and that there was a bunch of different methods of creating a provisional cast-on. And I could never remember. I didn't do them often enough to be able to remember how to do them or which one was easier for me. So I just took out all my books, looked at all the different websites I could for different provisional cast-on methods, and I just did them one by one. I thought, which one can I remember? That was my criteria. I don't care. They all seem to get me to the same place. Which one can I remember? Which one is based on a technique that I already use that I can remember? So for a while, that was my criteria. And then it was, well, let's really compare these. Are they the same? Do they actually create the same end result? And why do they create the same end result? Like, what is really going on? And why is it that all these different hand maneuvers can produce that same thing? And I learned that some of that has to do with just knitting style, whether your predominant style is continental. Certain types of techniques were created in a culture that had continental knitters, where other types of techniques that produce the same result arose out of cultures that used the right hand, the English method of knitting. So So sometimes those techniques did produce the same result, and sometimes they were just very, very similar. And once I really looked at what was happening and how these were the same and how they were different, I sometimes came up with my own method. I'm like, okay, well, this would be a lot easier for me if I did this and this and that instead, and I get the same result. And I don't have, like, I remember learning a pinhole cast on and learning Emily Ocker's cast on, learning TechKnitter's method, and learning something else. And they all seemed really hard to me. And they either involved extra tools or weird manipulations that I found difficult, or I had to transfer things from what I had to other double points with hardly any stitches. And it was really hard. And so I looked at what's actually happened. Oh, there's this tail and the new stitches are being created around that tail. What's another way of being able to do that? And I came up with my own method. And then years later, I learned, oh, well, the crochet method where you can do knit one yarn over, where I did a whole series on how to use the crochet cast on method to do all kinds of things like pinhole cast on, tubular cast on, provisional cast on, all, you know, just a whole bunch of different things. And I thought, well, that makes the crochet cast on a lot handier for me than it used to be, you know. So all of that stuff, a lot of it is experimenting. Some of it's problem solving. Sometimes it's things I've never thought about until somebody asked a question and I wondered about it. And sometimes it's, oh, I know this would be a good idea for a video. And then I start thinking about, well, what do people need to know ahead of time in order to be able to do this? Well, maybe I really need to do a couple other videos before that, before I get to this. Like with grafting, I was going to do some kind of grafting thing, and I thought, you know, I really should do this one and that one and the other one first. So a lot of it is experimenting. A lot of it is just hearing people talk about things, or just me or people asking questions, and I start thinking about it. And much of it is due to the Master Hand Knitting program, but not directly. It's a sort of an indirect result of having learned how to look at knitting differently, how to evaluate what I see, and then having that mental shift between superficial reading my knitting and AnalyKnitting. So that's it for this week. Just one more reminder that if you would like to buy me a coffee on Ko-fi, my Ko-fi page link is right below, and I'll put it down in the description. If you have any comments or questions about today's video, or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, if you have more feedback on knit-alongs, I'd love to hear it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.